The woman in seat 14B had been crying for 20 minutes, and nobody in the entire departure lounge of Toronto Pearson International Airport seemed to notice except Celeste Fairfax. That wasn't unusual. Celeste noticed things. It was, according to her manager, both her greatest professional asset and her most exhausting personal quality. She noticed when the ambient temperature in Terminal 3 dropped 2 degrees, because someone had propped open the service door near Gate 62. She noticed when the translation on the bilingual signage above the Air Canada desk had a grammatical error in the French that had been there for 11 months. And she noticed when a passenger was quietly falling apart in a plastic chair while everyone else stared at their phones. She walked over. "Can I get you anything?" Celeste asked. Not in the practiced brisk tone of an airport customer service representative. In the tone of someone who actually wanted to know. The woman, mid-60s, traveling alone with a carry-on that had a yellow ribbon tied to the handle, looked up. "I'm fine," she said, which was clearly the most inaccurate sentence anyone had spoken in that terminal all morning. "Your flight to Halifax boards in 40 minutes, Celeste said, sitting in the chair beside her. "That's enough time for a tea if you want company." The woman's name was Margaret. She was going home to bury her sister. They talked for 25 minutes, and when boarding was called, Margaret stood up and gripped Celeste's hand with both of hers and said, "Thank you. I didn't know I needed that." Celeste walked her to the gate. She was halfway back to the customer service desk when she heard a voice behind her. "Do you do that for everyone?" She turned. The man standing 6 feet away was holding a leather portfolio and watching her with the kind of focused attention that felt slightly different from the ordinary glance of someone who had simply noticed something. He was tall, dark suit, no tie, the kind of quiet presence that didn't need volume. He looked like he had arrived from somewhere important and was in the middle of deciding whether somewhere important could wait. "Do what?" Celeste asked. "Sit down with strangers, when they need it." She looked at him evenly. "Is that a problem?" He held her gaze for a moment. Something in his expression shifted, not softening exactly, but adjusting the way a lens adjusts when it finds its focus. "No," he said, "it's not." He didn't say anything else. He turned and walked in the direction of the executive lounge, and Celeste went back to her desk, and neither of them had exchanged names. She thought about that for the rest of her shift and couldn't quite explain why. His name, she found out 3 hours later, was Nicholas Hargrove. The general manager of Pearson's corporate partner division called him our primary account contact. The woman at the priority check-in desk called him the one who never smiles. The security supervisor, whose name was Frank and who had been at Pearson for 19 years, called him that architect fellow who redesigned the private terminal last year and didn't take a single break the whole 3 weeks. Nicholas Hargrove, 41. Head of development at Hargrove & Strand, the architectural firm his grandfather had founded in 1961 and which now had offices in Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal. He was at Pearson because the airport authority had contracted his firm for a major expansion of the international arrivals experience, a redesign meant to change how travelers felt the moment they walked through customs and into Canada for the first time. What nobody had mentioned, and what Celeste discovered only because she was the kind of person who read internal briefing notes thoroughly, was that Hargrove & Strand had submitted their preliminary proposal 3 weeks ago, and that the airport's head of passenger experience, Celeste's department, had been formally requested to provide a written assessment by Friday. She read that last line twice. The next morning, she submitted a 12-page document. She didn't see him again until Thursday. It was in the service corridor on the east side of Terminal 1, the one passengers never saw, and staff used to move between the retail concourse and the operations hub without going through security checkpoints again. Celeste was carrying a folder of incident reports and walking quickly because she had a meeting in 6 minutes. Nicholas Hargrove was standing at the corridor junction with 2 people from his firm, studying a printed floor plan spread against the wall. He saw her first. "The assessments team," one of his colleagues said, nodding in her direction in the way people do when they've been briefed on someone's job title, but not on them as a person. "Passenger experience," Celeste corrected without breaking stride. If the assessment team had concerns about traffic flow through the proposed east corridor, they're on page 7. The colleague opened his mouth. Nicholas said, "She's right. We addressed it this morning." He looked at Celeste. "Did you write the assessment yourself?" "It's in my job description. That's not what I asked." Celeste stopped walking. She turned around and looked at him directly. "Yes," she said, "I wrote it." "The section on wayfinding psychology," he said. "Was that from a course or from working here?" "Both," she said. but mostly from watching 17,000 people get lost in the same spot over 4 years and trying to figure out why. Nicholas held the floor plan and said nothing for a moment. Then he nodded once, the way people nod when something confirms what they already suspected. Page 7 was useful, he said. Celeste went to her meeting. She was 2 minutes late, which had not happened in 4 years, and she chose not to examine why. That evening, in the break room that smelled of burnt coffee and microwaved soup, her colleague Anouk Biosoleil, who had worked at Pearson longer than anyone in the passenger experience division and had an almost forensic interest in interpersonal dynamics, sat across from Celeste with a paper cup and said, "The Hargrove people were asking about you, about my assessment, about you." Anouk stirred her cup, specifically him. He had a question about page 7. He asked Frank what your schedule was. Anouk looked at her over the cup rim. Frank Celeste. Nobody asks Frank anything that isn't about security protocols. Celeste placed her folder on the table. It's a professional inquiry. Sure, Anouk said with the specific tone of someone who has decided not to argue because the other person will figure it out eventually. The second time they had a real conversation, it was in the observation deck above Gate 72, which wasn't officially a staff amenity but which the operations team had quietly used for years on night shifts when the terminal was quiet and the runways lit up like a grid of amber and blue. Celeste went there when she needed to think. She hadn't expected anyone to be there at 9:40 on a Tuesday evening. Nicholas was standing at the window with a coffee cup and a roll of revised blueprints under his arm. He turned when she pushed the door open. "I'm interrupting," she said. "No." He looked at the window. "I was trying to figure out why this terminal feels wrong." She came to stand beside him, not close, at the kind of distance that allowed both of them to look at the same thing without making it mean anything specific. Below, the last evening flights were taxiing toward their gates. The ground crew moved in their orange vests with the practiced efficiency of people who had done the same thing 10,000 times and still did it right. "The ceiling," she said. He looked at her. "The ceiling height drops 3 meters between the main atrium and the gate concourse. You walk through the atrium and you feel open, like you're somewhere important. Then you reach the gates and the ceiling comes down and suddenly you feel like you're in a corridor. Your body registers the change before your mind does." She looked up. "It creates a low-grade anxiety people can't name, which makes them more impatient at the gate, which makes delays feel worse than they are." Nicholas was quiet for 8 seconds. She counted, not on purpose. "How long have you known that?" he asked. "About 2 years. I wrote a memo." "To whom?" "To the previous director of operations, who responded by asking me to book the conference room for Thursday. And the conference room was for a catering review." She said this without bitterness, the way people describe weather. Nicholas looked at the ceiling above Gate 72 for a long moment. "The new design brings it up by 4 meters across the entire concourse." "I know," she said. "I read the proposal." He looked at her sideways. "All of it? It's 78 pages. Most people read the executive summary. The executive's summary left out the part about the natural light corridor on the north face. That's the most interesting part." Nicholas turned to face her properly for the first time that evening. He looked at her the way he had looked at the floor plan in the corridor, like something that required his full attention and was getting it. "What do you think of the light corridor?" "I think it'll work in July," she said. "I think in January, when it's dark at 4:30 and snowing and passengers are already stressed, that corridor is going to feel like a gray tunnel unless you compensate with warm artificial light on the east wall." Nicholas set his coffee cup down on the narrow ledge. He pulled the blueprints out from under his arm and unrolled them against the window. They stood there for an hour and 20 minutes. He asked questions and she answered them, and sometimes he disagreed, and sometimes she disagreed back. And once they were both quiet for almost 2 full minutes because they'd reached a point in the conversation that neither of them could quite solve quickly. The runways below them cycled through arrivals and departures. The terminal fell to its nighttime quiet. Neither of them mentioned leaving. When Celeste finally looked at her watch, it was 11:15. "I should go," she said. "Yes," he agreed. He hadn't moved. She rolled up the blueprints and handed them back. "The east wall," she said. "Birchwood panels, not synthetic. The grain matters." Nicholas took the roll. He looked at her for a second longer than was necessary. "I'll note that." She was at the door before he said her name. She turned. "Celeste," he said, the first time he had used it. "Thank you." She nodded. She left. In the elevator going down, she stood looking at her reflection in the polished steel doors and had the distinct, inconvenient feeling that she had just made something more complicated than she had intended. What she didn't know was that in the observation deck above Gate 72, Nicholas Hargrove stood at the window looking at the runways for another quarter of an hour, the blueprints in his hands, before finally rolling them back under his arm and taking the elevator down himself. And that his senior partner, Diana Strand, had been watching the light in that observation window from the atrium below and was now typing a name into her phone. Celeste Fairfax. 2 mornings later, Anouk was at the desk when Celeste arrived, and the particular quality of Anouk's silence, the loud kind, told her that something had happened. "What?" Celeste asked. Anouk handed her a printed email. It came to the department head, copied to HR and the project liaison. Celeste read it. She read it again. The email was from Diana Strand. It thanked the Passenger Experience Division for their thorough assessment and noted that the Hargrove and Strand team had found the input valuable. It also noted, in the second-to-last paragraph, that the project's internal review process had flagged a potential conflict of interest, specifically that one member of the assessment team had spent extended informal time with a member of the development firm during a non-scheduled interaction in a restricted area of the terminal. The email did not Celeste's name. It didn't need to. There was only one restricted observation deck above Gate 72. Celeste placed the paper flat on the desk. She looked at the window behind the check-in counter. Outside, the first morning flights were pushing back from the gate in the gray November light. "How many people received this?" she asked. "The department distribution list," Anouk said. "About 30 addresses." 31, said a voice from down the hall. That was Gordon from operations, who had the specific gift of always knowing slightly more than he should. He looked at Celeste with the expression of someone who felt genuinely sorry and was about to demonstrate this by sharing additional bad news. "I heard the director's assistant mention it to someone at the coffee station this morning." The words professional judgment were used. Celeste picked up her bag. "Thank you, Gordon," she said in the tone that meant the conversation was over. She went to the bathroom. She stood at the sink with the water running and looked at herself in the mirror for 45 seconds. She turned off the tap. She dried her hands. She went back out. Anouk was at the desk. "You're not fine," she said. "I know," Celeste said, which was more honest than her usual answer. "Give me an hour." In that hour, she pulled her own access log for the past 90 days, reread Diana Strand's email 4 times, and reached a conclusion that she did not like but could not ignore. The observation deck was technically a restricted area, yes. She had been there dozens of times without issue because it was an open secret among the operations team and nobody had ever considered it a concern. Nicholas Hargrove had been there because someone from the facilities team had cleared his firm for access during the renovation assessment period. The email was not a complaint. It was a construction. It was built precisely to imply something without alleging it, to raise a question in the minds of 31 people without ever asking it directly. It was, Celeste thought, quite well written. She respected the craft even as she felt the impact. At 10:15, she sent a request through the internal system for a meeting with the Director of Passenger Experience. At 10:40, the director confirmed. At 11 sharp, Celeste sat across from her director and did not wait to be asked. "I want to address the Strand email before you form an opinion from it," she said. Her director, whose name was Paul Ossie and who had the careful neutrality of someone who had managed airport personnel for 22 years and had heard most things, folded his hands on the desk. "Go ahead." She laid it out. The timeline, the blueprints, the legitimate professional exchange. The fact that the conversation had resulted in a specific technical recommendation, birchwood paneling on the east wall of the North Light Corridor, that was documented, traceable, and professionally sound. "I was doing my job," she said, "on my own time in a space I've used for years without incident, talking about a project I've spent 4 years accumulating expertise on." She placed a folder on the desk. "My access log for the past 90 days. No project files accessed outside of working hours. No correspondence with Hargrove and Strand personnel beyond what's in the official assessment record." Paul Ossie looked at the folder. He didn't open it immediately. "Diana Strand is a senior partner in the firm the airport authority has contracted for a $40 million project," he said carefully. "I understand the context," Celeste said. "What I'd ask is that the context not be allowed to substitute for evidence." Paul looked at her for a long moment. "I'm going to need to speak to the project liaison, of course." She stood. "I'd ask that whatever conversation happens next involves me directly. Not a hallway rumor and not a copied email." She left his office with the folder and the particular steadiness of someone who is very angry and has decided to be precise about it instead. In the elevator down, her phone buzzed, a message through the airport's internal system. Sender, N. Hargrove and Strand. I've been informed about the email. I want you to know I wasn't consulted before it was sent. Celeste read it twice. She put her phone in her pocket. She found Anouk at the desk. How bad is it? Anouk asked. It's bad enough, Celeste said. Make me a coffee and don't tell anyone I look upset. You don't look upset. Good, let's keep it that way. She found him in the design suite on the 3rd floor of the contractor office block, a temporary structure the airport had installed on the east parking lot for the duration of the project. Nicholas was standing at a drafting table with 2 colleagues she hadn't met, and he looked up when she came in the way people do when they've been waiting for something to happen and aren't certain they're ready. Can I have a few minutes? She said to the room. The 2 colleagues glanced at Nicholas. He nodded once. They left. The door closed. Celeste put her bag on the nearest chair and looked at him across the table. He looked back. Neither of them performed composure. They had both had a difficult morning, and they both knew it. Did you know she was going to do that? Celeste asked. No. He said it without qualification. I found out at 8 this morning when the project liaison copied me on the reply. Diana had sent it at 7:40. Why would she do it? Nicholas was quiet for 3 seconds. Because she's been watching how the project is developing, and she has her own ideas about what elements should drive the final design. He looked at the drafting table. Ideas that don't include input from the passenger experience division. Celeste sat with that. She's protecting the design from being influenced by the operations team. She's protecting her interpretation of the design. He looked up, which is different, and the email was a way to cut off the source of the influence without confronting the content directly. Nicholas didn't say anything. He didn't need to. That's tidy, Celeste said without admiration. What's in your design that she's worried about? He reached past the table and pulled a thick folder from the shelf behind him. He opened it to a marked page and turned it toward her. A set of revised interior elevations. The east wall of the north corridor with warm birchwood paneling along the full length. The natural light corridor with compensating warm-toned fixtures on the left side for low-light conditions. Everything they had discussed on Tuesday evening. She doesn't like the wall treatment, he said. She thinks it reads as provincial. She wants something more contemporary. Something that photographs well, Celeste said. Yes, and the lighting adjustment for January. She thinks it's unnecessary. Celeste looked at the elevation for a moment. It's not unnecessary. It's the difference between people feeling like they've arrived somewhere warm and people feeling like they're still standing in an airport. I know, Nicholas said. She's your senior partner, I'm aware. What does that mean for the design? He looked at her steadily. It means I need to make the case internally, and I need to make it well. Celeste picked up the folder. She looked at the elevation again, then she put it down. I'm going to write a second assessment, she said. An addendum to the first one, specific to the North Corridor and the January light conditions. I'll reference the passenger data we have from the last 3 winters. She looked at him. That's in my job description. That's unambiguous. Whatever Diana Strand tries to do with a copied email, she can't do anything with documented professional evidence. Nicholas was still. You don't have to do that, I know. She picked up her bag. But I was doing my job on Tuesday evening and I'm going to keep doing it. He looked at her for a long moment with that same quality of attention she had noticed in the departure lounge. Full, direct, unhurried. The email made things difficult for you. It was designed to. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry, she said. Fix the wall. She left. He stood at the drafting table and looked at the elevation for a long time after she was gone. The addendum took her 2 evenings. It was 14 pages. She cited 3 studies on how natural light attenuation affected passenger stress response in northern terminals. She attached 4 years of anonymized complaint data organized by month, which showed with unreasonable clarity that negative passenger experience reports spiked by 31% in January and February, and that the most common language used in those reports involved words like closed in, bleak, and gray. She submitted it on Friday morning. By Friday afternoon, the project liaison had forwarded it to the Design Review Committee. By Friday evening, Nicholas had called a meeting of the full Hargrove and Strand team for Monday morning. By Friday night, Diana Strand had sent Celeste a second email. This one was shorter and addressed to her directly. It thanked her for her contribution. It noted that the design process was well in hand. It included, in the final line, a sentence about how the airport authority would naturally want to ensure a clear separation between assessment and design functions going forward. Celeste read it at her kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold. She read it again. She put the cup in the sink, went to her desk, opened her laptop, and wrote a letter. It was a resignation letter. It was 4 paragraphs. It was very carefully worded and completely sincere, and it said, among other things, that she believed her continued presence in the passenger experience division would create an ongoing distraction from the legitimate professional work she had spent 4 years doing, and that she preferred to leave on her own terms rather than wait to be managed out through implication. She saved it. She did not send it. She went to bed at 11. She lay on her back looking at the ceiling, which was unfortunately a perfectly standard height with no design failures to distract her. She thought about Margaret with the yellow ribbon on her bag. She thought about Gate 72 at 11:15 on a Tuesday. She thought about birchwood paneling and the specific quality of winter light coming through a north-facing window. She got up at 6. She made coffee. She looked at the letter on her laptop screen. She sent it at 8:15. She did not go through the main entrance that morning. She went through the staff entrance on the south side, badged through with the key card that still worked because resignations didn't take effect instantaneously, and nobody had thought to process hers yet. She walked through the service corridor to the passenger experience office. She put the letter in a physical envelope on Paul Osie's desk because she thought it deserved paper, not just a screen. Anouk was already at the desk when she came out. "I heard," Anouk said. Celeste wasn't sure how. She was also not surprised. "Don't tell me I don't have to," she said. "I wasn't going to," Anouk said, which was the thing Celeste had always appreciated most about her. She handed Celeste a coffee. "What are you going to do?" "Walk through the terminal," Celeste said. "One more time, at my own speed." She did exactly that. She went through the International Departures Concourse, through the Sky Bridge, to Terminal 3, through the retail section she had reorganized the wayfinding for in 2021, past the gate where she had sat with Margaret on a Thursday morning that felt much longer ago than it was. She stopped at the spot where the ceiling dropped between the atrium and the concourse. She stood there for a moment, then she went home. At 2 in the afternoon her phone rang. Unknown Toronto number. "Celeste Fairfax," she answered, out of habit. "Miss Fairfax." A man's voice, measured, professional. "My name is Bernard Kowalczyk. I'm the project director for the Pearson expansion on behalf of the Airport Authority. I believe you submitted a resignation letter this morning." "I did. I'd like to meet with you today if possible. I've had a chance to read your assessment and your addendum. I have some questions I'd like to ask in person." She was quiet for a moment. "About what specifically?" "The North Corridor," he said, "and the East Wall." Bernard Kowalczyk's office was not at the terminal. It was in a glass and concrete building on Airport Road, the kind of functional office space that existed purely to facilitate things rather than to impress anyone. He was tall, 60s, with the manner of someone who had managed large infrastructure projects for a long time and had learned to recognize which problems were structural and which were political. He shook her hand. He gestured to a chair. He had both assessments on the desk in front of him, printed and highlighted. "I want to be direct," he said. "Please," she said. "We received the Strand email last week. We also received through our own channels information suggesting that the impetus for that email may not have been solely professional." He looked at her carefully. "We requested the security footage from the observation deck as part of a routine review." Celeste sat very still. "The footage shows a 40-minute conversation about blueprints," he said, which is not what the Strand email implied. She let out one breath slowly. "The Airport Authority has also received a formal complaint from Hargrove and Strand," Bernard continued. "Filed this morning. From Nicholas Hargrove, against Diana Strand, for distributing a misleading internal communication without his knowledge or consent." Celeste looked at the window. "He didn't tell me he was going to do that," she said. "No, but it's consistent with the internal review we were already conducting." Bernard folded his hands. "Mrs. Fairfax, your resignation letter was forwarded to me by Paul Osie because it fell within the scope of this review. I'm not here to ask you to rescind it. That's your decision." He paused. "But I want you to know that the authority has no concern about your professional conduct. None whatsoever. And I want that on record, clearly, before you make any further decisions." Celeste sat with that for a long moment. "Who else knows about the security footage?" she asked. "The project team. And as of 1 hour ago, the Passenger Experience Department distribution list received a correction from Paul Osie's office. 31 people." She thought of Anouk reading it at the desk. She thought of Gordon from operations, who would know within minutes. "What happens to the design?" she asked. "The Design Review Committee meets Thursday," Bernard said. "Your addendum will be presented. Nicholas Hargrove has confirmed that the North Corridor treatment and the winter lighting compensation are both moving forward in the revised draft." Celeste looked at the printed assessments on his desk, her own words highlighted in yellow. "I'll think about the letter," she said. Bernard nodded. "That's all I'm asking." He was outside the building when she came out, standing on the concrete path with his hands in his jacket pockets and his breath visible in the November cold, and the bare-bones parking structure behind him doing absolutely nothing to make the scene look significant, which somehow made it more significant than it should have been. "How long have you been out here?" she asked. "About 20 minutes, he said. "You could have come inside. I wasn't sure you'd want to see me." Celeste stood on the path and looked at him. The sky was that particular November gray that Toronto does so well. Not threatening, just present, like a blanket someone forgot to take in. "You filed a complaint against your own senior partner," she said. She misused the firm's name to damage someone who had done nothing wrong. He looked at her directly. There wasn't a lot of ambiguity in what needed to happen. "It's going to make things complicated for you." They were already complicated. He took one hand out of his pocket. "Can I walk somewhere with you?" Celeste considered this for a moment. "There's a coffee shop 2 blocks east," she said. "The coffee is mediocre, but the chairs are good. I'll take it." They walked. The wind off the highway overpass made conversation slightly impractical for 30 seconds, so they were quiet and that was fine. The coffee shop was the kind of place where nobody would notice or care who came in. They ordered. They sat at a table near the window. Nicholas held his cup in both hands. He didn't start immediately, which she had noticed was a pattern with him. He waited until he had something worth saying. She found she didn't mind it. "I want to tell you something," he said. "About the firm, about Diana." He looked at the table. "She's been with Hargrove and Strand for 16 years. She was my father's hire. She's brilliant and she's exacting and she has a precise idea of what the firm should build and who should have a voice in those decisions." He looked up. "She decided about 2 weeks ago that you were an influence I didn't need, because of the observation deck, and because of page 7, he paused. "And probably because of the way I listened to you." Celeste set her cup down. "That's a lot of inference from a handful of conversations. Diana's been reading people for 30 years. She's usually right about the facts." He looked at her steadily. She was wrong about the conclusion. Celeste sat with that. What conclusion did she draw? That someone who had that kind of influence on my professional thinking would eventually have influence on other decisions, and that influence from outside the firm is a risk. "She's not wrong about the logic," Celeste said. "No," Nicholas agreed. "She's wrong about whether it's a problem." Outside, a streetcar went by on Airport Road, which it technically shouldn't have been doing this far out, but did anyway. The coffee shop door opened and let in a wall of cold air and then closed again. "My grandfather built the firm's first project in 1964, Nicholas said without preamble, the way he did everything. "It was a library in Brampton. 3 floors, natural brick, reading rooms with north-facing windows because he said north light is the honest light. It doesn't flatter, it just shows things as they are." He turned his cup in his hands. "When I took over from my father 7 years ago, Diana assumed the firm's direction would stay the course. That course was glass and steel and buildings that looked important. Which is fine. Some of those buildings are excellent. But," Celeste said, "but I've been trying to bring the firm back towards something he would have recognized. Buildings that feel like they were built for the people inside them, not for the photographs outside them." He looked at her. "Page 7 of your assessment. The section on how architecture affects the emotional state of people in transit. I haven't read anything that articulate on that specific topic outside of academic journals. I'm not an academic. I know, it's better." He said this simply, without trying to make it a compliment. It landed as one anyway. Diana sees that as a shift in the firm's identity. She's not wrong. She doesn't want it to happen. And she thought removing the source of the inconvenient input would slow it down, Celeste said. "Yes." Celeste looked out the window. A plane was descending toward Pearson in the gray distance, the red light on its wing just visible. "The wall is staying," she said. "The wall is staying, and the winter lighting, birchwood and warm-toned fixtures on the east face. Exactly as you described." He looked at her. "What about the letter?" Celeste was quiet for a moment. "I've been at Pearson for 6 years," she said. "I know where every ceiling drops. I know why the foot traffic backs up at the South Customs Hall on Sunday evenings and what would fix it. I know that the single most effective change ever made to passenger experience in Terminal 1 was moving the Tim Hortons 12 meters to the left." She looked at him. "I wrote all of that down. I submitted 14 pages of it, and before that I wrote 12 pages that got forwarded to a design team that actually used them." She paused. "That's not nothing." "No," Nicholas said. "It isn't. But I also know that if I go back, I'll spend the next 6 months working in a department where 31 people received a carefully worded email designed to make them doubt me, and I can't unring that bell." Nicholas didn't disagree. He looked at his cup. "What if the bell didn't need to be rung?" he said. She looked at him. "The airport authority is establishing a project advisory group for the second phase of the expansion," he said, "independent of both the design firm and the operational department. They need someone who understands both the human and the spatial dimensions of the terminal experience." He held her gaze. "Bernard Kowalczyk mentioned your name this morning. He mentioned it to you?" "He mentioned it in the same meeting where I filed the complaint about Diana." "So yes, to me among others." Celeste sat very still. "That's not a solution to what happened." "No," he agreed. "It's a next step. They're different things." She looked out at the November sky. The plane had landed. Somewhere in Terminal 1, the ceiling was still dropping 3 meters between the atrium and the concourse, and in about 4 years, when the new design opened, it wouldn't be. Because she had sat in an observation deck at 11:15 on a Tuesday and said what she saw. "I'm still angry," she said. "I know, not at you. I know that too." She looked at him. "You're very calm about all of this." "No," he said quietly. "I'm not, but I'm better at managing it than demonstrating it." She almost smiled. She looked at her cup instead. "What happens to Diana?" "The authority is reviewing the firm's contract conditions. There are provisions. It won't be quick, but it will be thorough. She'll know it was you. She already knows." Celeste thought about the yellow ribbon on Margaret's carry-on. She thought about the observation deck and the runways below. She thought about North Light, honest light, the kind that shows things as they are. "I'll withdraw the letter," she said. "But I want Paul Ossie to acknowledge the correction formally, in writing. Not an email to 31 people. A letter to my file. That's completely reasonable. And the advisory group, I'll consider it. After I know what it actually involves. I'm not accepting a title that turns out to be a way to manage me sideways." "I wouldn't offer you something like that," he said. "And if it turned out to be something like that, I'd expect you to say so," loudly, she said. "I'd prefer it." She looked at him. He looked at her. Outside, the gray November sky was doing its best, which in Toronto in November was just enough. "There's a design review on Thursday," she said. "At 10. The North Corridor model. Is it built yet?" "It's in the design suite. Scale model 1 to 50. I'd like to see it." Nicholas was quiet for 2 seconds. "I'll have your access cleared." They finished their coffee. They walked back toward the terminal in the wind, not saying much, which was fine. At the staff entrance, Celeste badged through and then stopped in the doorway. "One more thing," she said. He stopped. "Your grandfather's library in Brampton," she said. "The one with the north-facing windows. What about it? Is it still standing?" Nicholas looked at her. Something in his expression did the thing she had learned to watch for, that quiet adjustment, like a lens finding its focus. "Yes," he said. "It's still standing." "I'd like to see that too," she said. "Eventually." She went inside. The door closed behind her with the click of something well-built. Nicholas stood on the concrete path for a moment longer, the November wind doing what November wind does, and then turned back toward the parking structure with the expression of someone who has been keeping track of something for a few weeks and has just confirmed that the count is accurate. The design review on Thursday went 3 hours over schedule, which in Bernard Kowalczyk's experience was the clearest possible sign that something important was being discussed. The North Corridor model sat in the center of the table. Birchwood warm against the steel of the table surface, the light corridor cut into the north face, the east wall finished in the exact tone Celeste had described from memory. She sat at the far end of the table with her folder closed, because by the time the meeting was 2 hours in, she didn't need it. She knew the material. She'd known it for years. At one point, one of the authority board members, a woman in her 50s who had been quiet for most of the meeting, looked at the model and said, "Why does that feel different from every other airport design I've seen?" Nobody answered immediately. Celeste said, "Because it was built for the person arriving, not for the person photographing." The room was quiet for a moment. The board member looked at her. "You should be on the advisory group," she said. "I know," Celeste said. "I'm considering it." 6 months later, when the North Corridor of the expanded International Arrivals Hall opened to the public for the first time, Celeste was there. Not with a clipboard, not with a badge. With a coffee in one hand and her coat folded over her arm, standing in the space where the old ceiling had dropped 3 meters and now rose into a continuous sweep of warm-toned glass and honest northern light. Around her, people came through customs with their luggage and their relieved faces and walked into a space that didn't make them feel like a problem to be processed. They stopped. A few of them looked up. One small child, maybe 4 years old, turned in a circle with her arms out, and her mother laughed, and both of them stood in the middle of the light for a moment that had nothing to do with catching a connection. Celeste watched this. She watched it for a long time. "The birchwood works," said a voice beside her. She didn't look over right away. She let the light do what it did. Honest, northern even, for another few seconds. "I told you," she said. Nicholas stood beside her, hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the space they had argued about in an observation deck on a November evening while the runways lit up amber and blue below them. He didn't say anything else for a moment because the room was doing the talking, and he had always known when to let that happen. "The child in the circle," he said quietly. "I saw, that's the one you can't put in a proposal." "No," she agreed, "you can't." They stood there while more people came through. Some of them hurried past, headphones in, rolling suitcases clicking on the new floor surface. Some of them slowed down. One couple, traveling together, both looked up at the same moment and then looked at each other, the way people do when they arrive somewhere and are glad they came. Celeste thought about 6 years of ceilings and ceiling heights, and the specific mathematics of why space makes people feel the way they feel. She thought about a woman named Margaret, and a yellow ribbon and 25 minutes in a departures lounge. She thought about 14 pages of data and what happens when the right person reads them. She thought about North Light. "The advisory group wants a second phase scope," she said. "I heard. Terminals 2 and 3. The design lead hasn't been confirmed yet." Nicholas turned to look at her. She turned at the same time, which was not synchronized on purpose, and probably looked it anyway. "I heard that too," he said. "I have opinions about Terminal 2, she said. "I'm aware. You're going to disagree with some of them. Probably. I'm going to be right. Possibly." He said this with the particular calm of someone who had already learned that being wrong about the birchwood was fine, because the birchwood was right. "I can work with that." Celeste looked at him for a moment. She looked at the corridor. She looked at the child who had stopped spinning and was now solemnly examining the floor surface with the focused curiosity of someone conducting a structural assessment. "There's a building in Brampton," she said. "I remember, you said eventually. I remember that too." She picked up her coffee cup. It was still warm. In the distance, through the glass of the North Light corridor, the sky above Toronto was doing something it almost never did in May. It was genuinely, uncomplicatedly blue. "Saturday," she said. Nicholas didn't say eventually. He said, "Saturday." And they stood there in the honest light, in the space they had argued into existence together, while the terminal around them did exactly what it had always been meant to do: receive people, and make them feel that arriving somewhere was worth the journey.